Chapter 5, Lesson Planning. This is what this whole class is about. This is why you are taking this class. This chapter right here is going to teach you how to create a lesson, one lesson, the lesson you're going to teach at the end of the semester. You will see that there are many components, but there's 4 basic components of a lesson. I have under resources a sample lesson on softball, and there are 11 components, but some are so small and minor. But the 4 components of the lesson that you are going to teach is what we talk about in this lesson plan here. But if you look under resources on my courses, you will see a lesson plan, a sample lesson plan. And the 4 parts that you are going to teach to the class is what we're talking about in Chapter 5. Lesson planning is a critical part of your teaching process. You have learned from teaching your activities to your classmates that even before instruction occurs, you have to make a lot of decisions to drive this learning process. So, it's a very critical part of the teaching process, lesson planning. As we learned in Chapter 4, and when we did our curriculum development, our weekly plan, it's time consuming. You have extensive planning to do, and it's going to be that way that first year. And then it gets a little bit less time requirement every year after that. But your lessons that are designed and implemented should be flexible. And they have to offer meaningful content to the students. We know from our curriculum development that we have to teach the content standards. So we're going to talk about 4 steps to develop a lesson plan. And as it says here, your pre-instructional decisions are just as important as the lesson content itself. Being prepared, planning ahead. Step 1, in order to develop a lesson plan, we need to determine our lesson outcomes. You might have heard the word objectives, which is the same thing, but they use the word outcomes. Whenever we worked with Chapter 4 for curriculum development, and we developed outcomes. Those were general outcomes for the week and such. Now we are going to develop outcomes for this specific lesson you're going to teach. So it's going to be precise and it's going to be measurable. So important. And when I say the word measurable, I mean you have to be able to see it. Okay, something you can see that's done. So the outcomes are what drives your assessments. How are we going to assess? We're going to talk about that later in Step 2. But they've come up with an ABCD test when creating your objectives or your outcomes. So in PE, the A for actor is the student. Now listen carefully. This is how I want it. You are going to start with your objective or your outcome with the letters capital T, capital W, capital S. The student will. I do not want the words, the student will. I want the abbreviation. I want the capital letters TSW. The student will. It's going to be followed by the behavior, the B of ABCD. The behavior is your verb. What verb are you going to use to determine their behavior? Most times, a lot of times, we'll use the behavior demonstrate. Because in PE, you're going to demonstrate as opposed to in the classroom. It has to be an observable behavior. It could be the student will skip, the student will hop, the student will dribble. The student will pass the ball. Okay? The verb is the behavior, and it must be observable. You can also have things like list or explain. Okay? but you can see somebody or hear somebody listed, or you can hear or see somebody explain. It has to be observable. I cannot stress that enough. And let me say this here. You cannot use the verbs know, K-N-O-W. How do you know they know? How do you observe if they know? You don't. And for me also, you cannot use the verb understand. The student will understand. No, how do you know they're understanding? We don't in PE, okay, unless you're doing some type of testing on them. But your verb that follows TSW, the behavior, has to be an observable behavior. In fact, I have Bloom's Taxonomy, a resource on my courses that if I was you, I'd print out that sheet of paper, and you can use that in the classroom as your level of cognitive level, and I've talked about that before. The C in the ABCD test is the condition. For instance, the student will be skipping, so TSW, skipping in a zigzag pathway is an example. So what's the condition? How are they doing? What are they doing? Okay, the student will demonstrate how to dribble a basketball to the cone and back for a distance of 10 feet. Okay, there's your condition. Okay, and then the degree. Some include this, some don't, but what criteria are you using for the students to be able to perform this task well? The book gives an example of 4 cues, and you might require 2 of the 4 cues. The condition for dribbling a basketball, the student will dribble a basketball to the cones and back with their eyes up, using the dominant and non-dominant hands. So there's your criteria, with the eyes up. So this is how you are going to write your objectives, your outcomes. Now, the book recommends 4 to 6 outcomes per lesson. I require a minimum of 2. You can have more. Some people require an objective for the introductory activity, the first part of your lesson that you'll be teaching, the second part of the lesson, the fitness, the third part of the lesson focus, and then the fourth part of the lesson, the games or activities. We're going to discuss these 4 parts in this chapter. I do not require 4 outcomes or objectives per lesson. I require a minimum of 2. And these objectives, these outcomes, are geared around the content standards, benchmarks, GLEs that you have to cover throughout the year at least once. Here on table 5.1 on page 84, notice the 5 standards, the 5 content standards that we discussed in chapter 1, and then notice the outcome. Notice the first one is always developmental level 1 for each content standard. The second one is developmental level 2, grades 3 and 4. And then the third one is for grade 5, developmental level 3. So instead of using the word I, which is what the book talks about, you know now you would put TSW, capital T, capital S, capital W, skip in a zigzag pathway, demonstrating 2 of the 4 cues. That would be your outcome. If you're teaching developmental level 2, which is grades 3 and 4, you would put TSW, kick a rolling ball, demonstrating 3 of the 4 cues. Now, you don't have to put demonstrating 3 of the 4 cues. You could put TSW, kick a rolling ball to a partner at a distance of 10 feet away. Okay? Something of that nature. But A is the actor, which is the student, so we know that automatically in PE, and that will be TSW. B is the behavior, and in these 2 examples, the behavior is skip and kick. And then what's the content? the rolling ball, okay? And then the D, which we said was the degree. So the degree would be demonstrating 3 or 4 cues. So they use that often. Let's see in some other one. Content Standard 2, Development Level 2, TSW, demonstrate fleeing and chasing in a game. Okay, so demonstrate is the behavior, fleeing and chasing is the content, and then the degree would be in a game or games. Okay, so these are some examples of how to write an objective or an outcome. You need to learn how to do this. You will be doing this. This is the only time I'm going to be covering it throughout the semester. So at the end of the semester, when you're creating your lesson plan, this is what you need to remember and focus on how to do it. Step number 1 was huge. How to write an objective or an outcome. That's huge. And this probably is the first time you've ever done it, so I take that into consideration. So once you did that, now step number 2 is generating an assessment tool. We only have 30 minutes in PE, so one assessment per lesson. More than one is not feasible, so we're only going to do one. We're going to select one to emphasize, and it should be reflective of our outcome, our objective that we wrote, okay? So the outcome, our objective, and the assessment, this is what your whole content of your lesson should be about. In Chapter 8, they talk about assessments. It can be as simple as you, the teacher, questioning the students. Another assessment could be a checklist, and they give examples in Chapter 8. It could be self-assessment, where the student assesses him or herself according to the skills or what's required to do that skill. It could be peer assessment, where you have this checklist and your student, one of your classmates is checking off when you do those certain parts right, and then y'all take turns in groups of 2. Another type of assessment could be a little test, a little written test, and that's what I used to do in the junior high and high school. Written tests, simple tests, true, false, multiple choice, making sure they know the rules of the games, because starting in 3rd grade, you play games. You play sports, rather. Step 3 is where we're going to select the specific activities for this particular lesson, okay? In Chapter 4, when we created our curriculum development, we had general activities for the week. Now, you're going to be choosing specific activities or games for the day, or several of them for the day. And in the book, they give the example of fleece ball fun. If that's the weekly lesson focus, then what are you going to choose that requires the fleece ball? What activities, what games can they play with? Can they play Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday using fleece balls? I use my fleece balls as a way to tag, to designate the taggers. You could include tag games that way. There's numerous, tossing and catching to self in place. We can use fleece balls for that instead of wiffle balls or something. Any activity, or any game, you can modify the game to use a fleece ball instead of the ball they suggest to use, if the game can be played appropriate that way. So any activity that requires fleece balls is what you would use or think up for Monday through Friday. Also, whatever activities you use, it should reflect what you, the teacher, will emphasize in terms of the lesson outcome. It's always about your lesson outcome, your lesson objective for the day. Also included in your lesson plan are these 4 components that you can include. We already did the outcomes. We did that in step 1. We haven't talked about the equipment. So when you are designing your lesson to teach to your classmates, or if we should get lucky and be able to go teach them at the elementary school, you want to include all the equipment required to teach that 30-minute lesson. Number 3, you're going to have instructional activities, the actual movements or the skills to be taught, which we did in step 3, and you're going to have it to where it's going to be in a proper developmental sequence. What I've talked about, the progression from tossing and catching, from dominant, toss with the dominant hand, catch with 2 hands. Toss with the non-dominant hand, catch with 2 hands. Then the next progression would be to be catching with 1 hand, but the dominant hand is always the more successful one, so that's what we start with. Tossing with dominant, catching with dominant. Tossing with non-dominant, catching with non-dominant. Tossing with non-dominant, catching with dominant. Then the next progression would be catching with non-dominant. So we're going to toss with dominant, catch with non-dominant. Toss with non-dominant, catch with non-dominant. And that's the hardest, to toss and catch with non-dominant. That's the most challenging, so that's what you would want to end with. I love the fact that this new book has taken the lesson itself and created a whole chapter just about lesson planning. It wasn't like that in the old books. So here are the 4 parts of the lesson that you are going to teach. There, as I said, there are 11 parts to my lengthy lesson, but one of them is as simple as your method for checking for understanding. One of them is equipment. One of them is the content standards, benchmarks, and GLEs. One of them is safety. One of them is closure. So some of them are very minor and simple, but these that I'm about to talk to you about are the 4 parts of the lesson that you are going to teach. So the first part is the introductory activity, which is your warm-up activity. I want you to know it will last from 2 to 3 minutes. That's it. For a 30-minute lesson, it's only going to be 2 to 3 minutes. But I want you to know it sets the tone for the rest of your lesson. It sets the tone. So you want the students moving as soon as they come in, if possible, to the gym or playing area. So an effect, you might need to practice management skills. And why do I say that? If you begin teaching your introductory activity, but then they're not behaving, they're not listening, you can't teach the lesson because it's after Thanksgiving holidays and their first day back and they're all hyper. So stop. Don't teach the introductory activity. We need to teach management because apparently they forgot about it, of what your management requirements were during Thanksgiving break. So an effective rule of thumb I want you to know is to have them move and freeze them 3 times. Make sure they understand. Like our whistle mixer, have them move and then freeze and then put it, if you want to do that, put them in groups of 2 and then move and freeze groups of 4, move and freeze group of 3. But if they're not cooperating, if they're not behaving, then you're going to have to use your introductory activity and forget about the one you have in your lesson plan, and you're going to have to work on management and cooperation. So do the rule of thumb. The effective rule of thumb, move and freeze your class 3 times. Skip the introductory activity. You need to practice management skills. So, and as it says here, if you can, you want to engage them in immediate activity and to prepare them for the physical activity, which is part 2. Now, the other thing you want to take note of, whenever you're choosing your introductory activity, you want to choose something with minimal instruction. Minimal instruction. Why? You only have 2 to 3 minutes. That's it. You don't want to spend a whole lot of time on your introductory activity. So, I want you to know you should try and engage them in immediate activity upon entering the area, and make sure that I hope you realize that you're preparing them for the physical activities that you're about to teach. The second part, the next phase, the second part of your lesson that you are going to actually teach is the physical fitness part, the physical fitness and activity part. So I want you to know this is designed to enhance the health-related fitness that we talked about in Chapter 14, and it's all about promoting lifetime physical activity. Lifetime physical activity. There's nothing more rewarding than for a teacher to see students who have graduated years ago and they are active, they are doing things, and they enjoy doing it. There's nothing more rewarding as a teacher. So, it's all about the health-related fitness that we talked about in Chapter 14. You're going to teach them the type and amount of activity needed to maintain a healthy lifestyle. And we discussed all this in great detail in Chapter 14. We taught the introductory activity. We taught the physical fitness. Now you're going to teach your lesson focus. And this is going to be about 10 minutes of your 30-minute lesson. Your lesson focus is what physical skill are you going to teach? Now, there's exceptions to the rule, but for the majority of PE, what are the physical skills you're going to teach? And how do you teach that skill? If you're going to teach them throwing, well, go to the softball chapter, and there's a little section on throwing, how to throw, how to teach throwing. So here, on your lesson focus, I want you to know it's designed to teach physical skills. You're helping the students meet the program content standards that you came up with, and how are we going to do this? By repetition, 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 and refinement. In a sequential manner, successful setting, but repetition and refinement is what we do in PE. Now, in the repetition, we might be tossing and catching, but remember the progression we talked about from dominant to eventually non-dominant to non-dominant, okay? And then, and you can also go further distances apart. That can be your sequence, okay? So, introductory activity, followed by physical fitness, followed by your lesson focus. Now, whenever we're doing the guided practice in your lesson, the guided practice is how are you going to teach the lesson focus? For the first few seconds or a minute after the physical fitness part of your lesson, what are you going to do with them? Well, if you got to put them in a different formation compared to the formation they were in physical fitness, then that's the first thing you do. Just like when you teach your activity in the gym, what's the next thing you do after you put them in formation? Okay, if there's equipment, get them equipment. Teaching and demoing how to do the skill, then the students practice it. And then if there's some more you have to teach, the sequence, the order, the developmentally appropriate, that's the guided practice. You are not going to see any examples of the guided practice in this book. You have to think it through. If I were to ask you to come up with an order of steps from 1 to 10 to teach your activity in the gym with us with your classmates, what would be the order that you would do? The first thing you would do is maybe whistle, mix, or skip and put them in groups, and then you would place where the groups would go. Then the next thing you would do is say, okay, class, we're going to play such and such. And then you explain it, you demo it, you check for understanding. The students do it or play the game or whatever it might be. And then if there's a second component or a second part because there's a sequence to it, and you would list it step by step by step. Okay, so the lesson focus is what you are teaching, what skill you're teaching. The guided practice, which is the 10 minutes, is how are you going to teach the lesson focus? I repeat, The guided practice is how you are going to teach the lesson focus. So after these 10 minutes of following the guided practice list of instructions, then you're going to play your closing activity or your games. That's the last 10 minutes. Well, minus 1 minute. So the actual closing activity, I want you to know, may be a game using the skills that were developed in the lesson focus. It doesn't have to be, but it usually is, but it doesn't have to be. Or it could be some type of low organized game from chapter 22. There's numerous games listed in chapter 22. Or it can just be something you're going to have them do for enjoyment. Depends on your lesson focus for the day. It depends on the lesson focus of the day. And you will learn with your weekly plan when designing your lesson focus for the day. You'll see what I'm talking about. Then when you write up your guided practice, you'll have those steps by steps by steps. If you look at my lesson plan on softball, my sample lesson plan on my course, you'll see what I'm talking about. So, physical introductory activity, 2 to 3 minutes. Physical fitness, 5 minutes. Your lesson focus and guided practice, 10 minutes. Closing activity or game, 10 minutes. And then you conclude with the last minute of what we call closure. What are some other considerations when planning your lessons? It's always proper progression. The majority of your lesson, in PE, we're going to be teaching psychomotor skills. So we always want to have a progression from least challenging to most challenging. I want you to know least challenging to most challenging, and I want you to know from simple to complex. Simple to complex. A very good idea is to review what you previously taught them, maybe the day before. I like to do that in my introductory activity sometimes. Like if you're working on soccer and you worked on dribbling with the inside of the foot the first day. Well, that would be my introductory activity for them to practice dribbling with the inside of the foot. They might have to do it in partners because you don't have enough soccer balls, but that's a very good introductory activity. But you always want to review what they previously learned before you proceed to something new. So you want them to learn the skills. You want to learn the skills before trying the activities, if at all possible. Okay? So I kind of summarized table 5.2, which is on the next slide, but these are the main points I want you to know. For developmental level 1, the level of difficulty I want you to know, developmental level 1 is the least difficult. Kindergartners through second graders. So the difficulty level is the least of all 3 developmental levels, and this is where you form the foundation so that they can learn the more complex skills later on. And most of development level 1 is going to be an individual type of situation or with a partner. Working in small groups can be challenging. Development level 2 is more difficult. You do work individually, you do work in small groups, but you're going to have different speeds of the ball, or you're going to have different sizes of the objects. And remember, we want to go from large objects in development level 1 to smaller objects in development level 2 and 3. Then development level 3 is definitely where I want you to know you have your advanced individual and specialized skills and activities, and that's where we're working with sports and games and your more complex motor patterns. So this is the table found on page 88 where they show the first column is the developmental levels, the grades for the developmental levels, and then look at the level of difficulty. Least difficult, more difficult, advanced individual and specialized skills, okay? Is it an individual or a group type of activity? You're mostly going to do individual activities for developmental level 1. Then progressing to individual and small groups. And then for development level 3, your fifth graders being able to play the games with the others, strategy and such. And then they give some examples of some characteristics: tossing and catching, specialized skills, sports and games. So what are some other factors we need to take into consideration when we're preparing our lesson? Environmental factors. You need to predetermine your space needs. A common error is just to take the class out and let them go wherever they want, on the playground or in the gym. Wrong, wrong, wrong. You need to delineate what the practice area is, either with cones or lines in the gym, something. You can't just tell them to just run. Or use some type of natural boundaries on the playground, like the fence or the tree or whatever it may be. So you might have to divide your space up into smaller areas to maximize the students being able to participate more effectively, dividing it up into 2 courts. If the areas are too close together, you got to be careful with that. So, second component or environmental factor is equipment. Equipment is always going to be an issue. It might be a limiting factor, as we know. We may not have enough equipment for 1 per student, so we might have to modify our lesson. So before you begin the lesson, before you take them out, before the day starts, you want to have looked at your equipment, see how much is needed, how much is available, how much is usable, okay? Because I want you to know, no more than 4 students should be waiting in line. I might let you stretch it to 5, but no more than 4 students should be waiting in line when waiting to perform an activity. Like if you're practicing dribbling soccer balls, okay, you can have 4 or 5 people waiting in line, and that's it. So plan your lesson accordingly. If your equipment is limited, as I said, you're going to have to adapt. They talk about talking to your principal or speaking to your parent-teacher groups about your dissatisfaction of not having enough equipment. But what are some alternatives? You might have to do what's called a task style of teaching, where you're going to divide the students up into small groups. Okay, so less balls are needed. You only need 1 ball maybe per group. The other option would be possibly peer review, where 1 student practices while the peer is giving some type of feedback or evaluation, which is basically partners or groups of 2. Another possible solution is where they stand in line. 4 or 5 people stand in line. Here's where they talk about how to distribute the equipment. If you have equipment, 1 per person, I want you to know, for test purposes, they are saying we should place it around the perimeter of the area. Well, if you don't know the definition of perimeter, then this is useless. So the definition of perimeter, peri, P-E-R-I, means around. So you want to place the equipment around. We play activities on half of the gym, so you would place the balls or whatever it may be around that half of the gym, to where the students go away from the center of the half of the court to go away and get the ball or piece of jump rope or whatever it may be, so that they're not accidentally hurting somebody or purposely hurting somebody when they go get the equipment. Another environmental factor is making sure you have a safe environment. In PE, injuries are inevitable. Just like in recess, you have injuries. But you need to make sure the injuries aren't due to poor planning, because then that's negligence on your part. So proper preparation is always good. So you want to conduct some safety inspections at regular intervals throughout the year. When you are designing your lesson, you need to figure out what formation you're going to have the students in. And here's some listed here, and they show great diagrams on page 91 to 92. And I really need to show you this in class as well, how to transition from one formation to another with minimal time loss. So the first formation they talk about is scattered. Personal space, spread your wings, whatever you want to call it, depending on the age group you're working with. The second type of formation is squad, where you have students in their lines, and what you would have it like for doing their fitness. And so you have your regular squad formation where they're fairly close to one another, or you have your extended squad formation where they would be spread out about fingertip apart, and that's really good for physical fitness so that you don't have to worry about them injuring themselves accidentally. Then you have the partner formation where I'm facing you, you're my partner, and we're X amount of feet apart, and then everybody has a partner, and so there's basically two lines. But I want you to know partner formation is really useful for reciprocal teaching. If I reciprocate, I'm going to do exactly like you're doing. So if we're tossing and catching, partner formation is very good. So you want to have two lines, and the partner A is facing partner B, and they're spread out far enough to where nobody's going to get injured. Your lane or file formation is very good for locomotor activities. The front of the lane moves and then takes their place at the rear of the lane. Line and leader is one option where the leader is standing there, and then you have 3, 4, 5, 6 students forming a line where the leader might toss and take turns tossing to each one of the students in the line. Another option for line and leader is where you have instead of a line, it's a semicircle. The students are in a semicircle, and the leader is still standing in front in the middle. But to toss and catch, it's the same distance now to each person in the semicircle. Double line formation is like a zigzag formation. That works well. You also have regular shuttle formation where maybe 4 students are aligned facing 4 students in another line, and then they may practice passing, and then they'll go to the back of the other person's line. Shuttle turn back is like regular shuttle, except whenever the students get to the middle, instead of crossing and then going to the other line, they're going to turn back and go back to their same line that they started with. Simultaneous class movement. If you have a large class, let's say you have 40 students, you could have 20 students on one side of the gym, 20 students on the other side of the gym, and they spread out far enough to where they stagger, and they might practice whatever type of skill, the dribbling skills maybe, and they'll cross each other midway and go to the opposite side of the court. Another one for simultaneous class movement, instead of crossing each other and going to the other side of the gym, when they get to the middle, they'll turn back and go back to the same side. And then the last option for simultaneous class movement, you break the class up into 4 groups, and 2 groups would cross like we did on the first one we talked about, crossing to the opposite sides. So 2 groups are crossing, 2 groups are waiting. The other 2 groups are waiting. And then when group 1 and 3 cross, then group 2 and 4 would cross. This is great when you have large class size, simultaneous class movement. On page 93, in the gold section at the top of the page, they talk about encouraging physical activity beyond the school day. So what are they talking about here? Well, you need to understand and know that most of the physical activity is going to take place outside of the school setting in some type of unstructured time after school and on weekends. So our job is to tie in what they learned in PE to the activities that they're going to be doing outside of school or even at recess, so that the students can understand and relate and understand why. Another possible approach is to get them physically active outside of the school setting. You assign them a physical activity homework calendar. How much physical activity are they doing after 3 p.m. and on weekends? So it can be homework, it can be an activity calendar, or it can be an activity map. So a very good discussion question or a reflective type of thinking would be, what could I have done better so the students would have learned more? Even at my age, even with all the years I've been teaching, I constantly think it may not be major changes, but little small minor things that I could have done to help the students learn more. So, how could this question make you a better teacher? You should always be reflecting on what you could have done better. If you don't, to me, that's time to retire, because life is nothing but a learning process. So no matter how young or old you are, we should always reflect on our strengths and weaknesses. After you teach your lesson, you are going to evaluate yourself. Reflective teaching. Because I want you to know, quality teachers do that. Quality teachers find time to reflect on all factors of the lesson that you've presented and what ways you can get the students to respond better. So once you start teaching, you need to take the time at the end of every day, or when it happens in the classroom, make a little note on your lesson that, scratch this out and put this, because that type of formation worked better than the one you had in your lesson. You may consider journaling to inspire you and give you insight. If you like to write, go for it. But successful teachers do change their lessons. It may not be often, like they say, but when you're you're beginning teachers, yes, you will change it often. But that's where your student teaching is so valuable and crucial, and your observations whenever you go. Observe, 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 and see what the teachers are doing. You may not agree with everything they do, but you can try it and see, okay? But make sure you reflect. So after you teach your PE lesson, I have a self-evaluation tool. I think there's 12 statements where you have to rate yourself rather, from 1 to 4, and then explain how'd you do, what you should have done. Okay, and that's another grade. So self-evaluation, reflective teaching. So what are the takeaways from Chapter 5? This is probably to me, a very, very important chapter in this book, because this is all about creating a lesson. So we've learned that we have to make some decisions prior to the lesson, a lot of decisions prior to the lesson, before our lesson planning can take place. Your curriculum should be the bones or structure of your program, and the lesson plans are your muscles that support them. So writing effective lessons takes time. It takes experience. It's not going to come overnight. They say it takes approximately 3 to 5 years for a teacher to feel somewhat comfortable in what she's doing and teaching, and knowing what she's doing outside the classroom as well as inside the classroom. And then reflecting on your teaching practice is a large part of being a quality teacher, not only a PE teacher, but a quality classroom teacher. Some good thought questions here. What would be some issues around teaching if you did not have your lesson plans? Why is your objectives or your outcomes selected so important when designing a lesson? What are the 4 parts of a lesson? What are the characteristics, the significance of each part? And what are several issues that PE teachers must address when preparing to teach? We know one is equipment, for sure. And the teaching area, if you don't have a gymnasium and it's raining or cold outside, then you need to do some things inside. GoNoodle is a great alternative for that, because you'll have the technology in the classroom. So this concludes Chapter 5, Lesson Planning. All of what you need to know about how to create your lesson is in this chapter.